Okay, I think we're ready to kick off. So hi everyone, welcome. It's so great to see so many of you here in the room in person tonight, so thank you. And it's also great, I'm sure we've got millions of people tuning in via the live stream, so hello as well, thank you for joining us. My name is Maddie Croucher, and I'm a senior consultant at Ogilvy's behavioural science practice. And I'm so honoured to very shortly welcome to the stage Rory Sutherland and Pete Dyson to talk about their new book, Transport for Humans. So to give you a little bit of an intro to our authors, even though I don't think they need any introduction at all, we've obviously got Rory Sutherland, who's Vice Chairman of Ogilvy and co-founder of the behavioural science practice here. He's also author of Alchemy, columnist in The Spectator. His accolades go on and on and on. And we've also got Pete Dyson, who is a principal behavioural scientist at the Department for Transport. He has asked me just to say that he's written this book in a personal capacity, so it doesn't in any way reflect government policy. It's very important to state.
So it fucking well should.
As a bit of a fun side fact as well, I just wanted to throw in, Pete is also just very casually like a semi-professional Ironman triathlete. Pretty amazing. So yeah,
using the roads for gyms, yeah. Instead of a mode of transport. But never mind, I'll let you off that one.
And yeah, I've had the pleasure of knowing Rory and Pete for about 6 years now, since I joined Ogilvy. And I can hand on heart say, I don't think I've ever met two more magical minds that complement each other so amazingly. I mean, you've got Pete with his relentless, eagle-eyed observations on human behavior in the real world. And you've got Rory with his big picture thinking and this uncanny ability to kind of drop these world-changing ideas seemingly out of nowhere. And when I look at their fabulous front cover, I have to be honest and say, it really makes me want to kind of study their brains and see how fast the neurons are leaping around in there, because they're both such brilliant thinkers. And as I'm sure you've guessed from the title of the book, what unites Pete and Rory is not just their love of human behavior, but it's also their absolute obsession for transport. So I remember my very first week being at Ogilvy, Rory's musings on the Eurostar, this time versus experience debate, saying why are they spending £5 million on making the train journey shorter when actually they could invest 1/10 of that in the customer experience and people would actually want to stay on the train even longer. To countless cab rides and train journeys with Pete, hearing his amazing stream of consciousness about how you could further optimize the escalators in the station to actually reduce what I think you call like pedestrian road rage, all the way to looking at train markings on the platform and actually how they're psychologically back to front. So I'm really excited that they now not only get to share these pearls of wisdoms over lunch or on a cab ride, but with you, the wider world, through this incredible book. And I can really promise you that it will change the way you view and experience transport forever to come. So this evening, what they're going to do is take you on a 60-minute a 60-minute journey. I'm getting lost in my own transport thoughts. A 60-minute journey, you can pretend you're on a train, with 3 stops along the way. So first, Pete's going to give us a bit of a tour of the book. Then Pete and Rory are going to share their reflections. And the final stop is going to be with you, the audience, to answer your questions. And that's both in the room here and for everyone on the live stream as well. So I could honestly go on all night. I've probably talked too much already. So now I want to hand over to the masterminds of the book themselves, Pete and Rory.
Thank you so much, Maddie. Your introduction is very generous. And are we nearly there yet? Well, this book may be new to you, but having worked on this for, 4 years or so, that's a question I can promise you we have been asking ourselves for quite a while. And yes, it has arrived. It has arrived. And it's a privilege to share it with you tonight. So yes, over the next 20 minutes, I'll be giving you a sort of guided tour of the book, I think. We're going to bring to life its 3 parts. And it'll be a whistle-stop tour. So sit back, enjoy, and I'm sorry, there is no at-seat trolley service on this particular journey. So, part one. I should get the pleasure to say next slide, please. Thank you. When we travel, we go by many names. We go by drivers, passengers, commuters, and increasingly pedestrians and cyclists. But ultimately, we're all human. And being human means being driven by a colourful mix of habits, of desire, of instinct, of social norms, and those social forces in the world around us. Now, the trouble is, for centuries, we've been treating each other as though we're an entirely different being. Now, that's for two reasons. First is because transport needs engineering to go. And because engineering requires numbers, quantified metrics like journey time, speed, capacity, strength, it's very easy for engineering to take the priority, at which point the people being transported become more like cargo. Cargo to be moved around very efficiently from A to B. But cargo doesn't have feelings, but people really do. And let's consider this tannoy announcement and how it makes you feel and I feel.
Please note, barriers close 2 minutes before departure.
Now, that's what you might hear at Euston Station. Barriers close 2 minutes before departure. Now, excuse me for a deviation, but let's face it, if the doors are shut, you can't get on or off the train, I'm afraid from the passenger's point of view, it has departed. Let's be frank. Yeah. Now, it's a rather cruel way to manage platform conduct and a particularly awful way to introduce new users to the network, many of which suffer a variety of different 30-second, 60-second or 2-minute start times. And it's emblematic of treating travelers more like cargo. Now, a more humane approach does exist across the Atlantic at Grand Central Terminus Station in New York. You'll see a departure board that actually lists the times of departure where the doors close actually 1 minute after the stated time, giving people a moment's grace. So you can see a small deviation, but a big benefit for many, many travelers. Now, I said we treat people differently in two ways. One as cargo, but secondly, as an entirely different species altogether. And that's because transport is ultimately a business, and economics has come to simplify our colourful nature into a more black and white caricature. In part one, we introduced a name for this strange species. We call him Homo transporticus. Homo transporticus builds on the literature economists may know about the thinking of economic man, or Homo economist. But Homo transporticus has some specialist travel traits. So he or she knows all the routes, they know where they are at every time, they're not afflicted by different moods, and their utility, their benefit, is to minimize their travel time. Now, these simple assumptions make the maths work, but they don't change the simple fact that we are human. So consider choosing how an electric car might be chosen, something millions of people are doing at the moment. Homo transporticus. Now, Homo transporticus would know that 95% of journeys are less than 50 miles. They'd know that's well within the stated range, and there's an abundance of public chargers. They'd have calculated the running costs, the grants, the dealership discounts, and the lifetime cost of ownership's well within their budget. Now, Homo sapiens may think some of these, but they have an additional set of concerns. We, as Homo sapiens, are inclined to be a little bit concerned about this new technology. We worry about the mere possibility of running out of juice. And we're concerned what life looks like with new refueling habits. Now, as Homo sapiens, we're also moved by different things. So we're moved by advertising that shows new cool features. And we're inclined to raise an eyebrow when we see a swathe of new green number plates showing up in our neighborhoods. Now, behavioral science, crucially, has tools to help settle some of these debates. Research using a randomized control trial of people, of about nearly 5 million people renewing their annual vehicle tax, found more clicks on the information about the number of thousands of people that were getting an EV each month, and more clicks on those that gave information about the air quality and health and the health benefits of EVs than it did those rational benefits. And that's ultimately what this book is about. So the central argument is, let's apply and grow our knowledge of how people think, feel, and behave when traveling. And let's use this to adapt transport to our individual and our collective needs. It's about yes and. It's saying, here's a new approach and a new map that sometimes course corrects and sometimes provides new ways alongside engineering and economics. It's not a battle, and sometimes the territory calls for a certain mode of thinking and a certain set of tools. So we call for a rebalancing. Now, are we nearly there yet? Well, there's an immediate getting there priority of improving the user experience, enabling the best bits to be enhanced and the painful bits to be minimized. For one thing, it's a categorical imperative. It's simply a moral case of treating people with greater dignity. It's also a commercial and a sustainable imperative to make transport, public transport in particular, competitive with several other options. The longer priority, and that's where we may take a little longer to get to, is adapting our social world. And this is where transport for humans plays into the wider points about what is purposeful and valuable about travel, and to look more outwardly to how we design our homes, our cities, our flexible working arrangements, and broader points about transport equity and fairness. Now, the good news is we've done many great things before. And in part one, we looked through the history across the world, in the past, and in different domains. And we find that there's cause for optimism. So did you know there are clever ways to help people alight at their station and get off the train at the right point? So back in the day, the Victorians used distinctively different tiling on the London Underground on the station walls so that people could remember their stop. Now, if we were in Moscow, we would hear a station announcement that sounds a little bit like this. Or maybe double click.
Октябрьская station. Interchange to line 6.
Уважаемые пассажиры, при выходе из поезда не забывайте свои вещи.
Now, on your first trip, that may mean absolutely nothing to you. Perfectly fine. But what you as a human are able to do is identify that as a male voice. Now, in Moscow, the trains going into the city centre use a male voice. The train on the same line going out of the city centre use a female voice. A very easy way to balance our options and a way to not get on the train and go one stop the wrong way. Now, Japan has gone further still. Now, each station there has a unique arrival jingle, specially composed to represent the character of and heritage of the neighborhood. So people instinctively learn to remember their stop and get a little bit from it. Maddie.
Please note, barriers closed.
Interchange.
The theme of four. Very calming. Much more intense. So these are simple tricks, if you like, but in the book we dub these a new word. We call them innervations. So using the psychological power we already have at our disposal to solve problems that technology and economics alone cannot fix. Innovations are extremely powerful. Now, we may talk about this later. The sad things about innovations is they seem obvious with hindsight. In the case of our Japanese station, in fact, much research has gone into the length, the tone, and the background of the announcement that you're hearing, as does many other sounds on Tokyo's metro. Now, it's with hindsight that we wish that we could develop more of these innovations, and it's with optimism that we think, just imagine what would be possible if we really put our minds to this. So that's why the end of part one illustrates what behavioral science is to new people to the discipline, how how transport generally is using the discipline at its edges, and we talk through a simple model that you can use to understand your travel behavior. So part one also brings us up to more contemporary times and up to 2019. And let's consider some really big numbers. because transport, at least I think, is a big deal. So in the UK alone, 400 hours of travel per person, £9,000 spent per household on average. As a nation, we collectively drive 1.8 billion kilometers per day. 1.8 billion kilometers per day, enough distance to travel to the sun and back 6 times. Now consider that transport is also the greatest emitting sector of all sectors in the UK and in many developed countries, and where it's found that 60% of the reductions in the emissions that we require will require some form of behaviour change. Now, this was the picture that much of the world left behind in 2020, when, for billions of lives, the transport node was effectively removed. And there's a moment for change here. Since then, we've had the chance to reflect and reawaken our priorities. We've been staying at home, we've been walking and shopping locally, we've been making essential journeys, some of us have been cancelling flights, ordering online, and finding whole new ways of working. After all this, we've collectively, I think, and we think, had a chance to think and reflect. Maybe the old way was a bit much, a lot of quantity of transport, not a lot of quality of transport. Transport for humans, we think at least, arrives just in time. Now, if that's part 1, I will go through more quickly through part 2 and 3, but part 2 takes on these big issues at hand that we all experience. It explains the psychological aspects with examples illustrated from behavioral science. Now, there are 6 chapters. I wish I could tell you about all of them, about car choice, about maps, about ticketing, about habits, and even about how we can think of transport more as a skill to be learned and to be honed. But we don't have all night. It's a 60-minute journey. Let's look at just one. On the chapter about how we perceive time, queues, and delays. That's ultimately the cause of this timeless nagging question, are we nearly there yet? Well, did you know, studies find that the return leg of a journey feels 22% shorter than its outward leg. Psychologists find that it's because we are less stressed and we know what to expect. And it actually partly explains why airlines find Londoners value flying out of City Airport more than they value returning to it. Now consider also a review, 17 studies, they find that waiting time can feel on average 3 times longer than travel time. But if we have entertainment with us, that diminishes significantly. Now, all these are interesting facts and insights and might lead to many thoughts, but Rory and I think behavioral science, when applied to transport, should also be done creatively. Here are 3 what-if questions we couldn't help but pose. So, what if our journey planners could actually suggest media that we could read, listen, or watch that would be just the right length to conclude just before we arrived at our destination? What if we had countdown display boards that show when to leave to catch public transport when we're sat at home, so that we don't leave things to the last minute and so that we're not in a rush? And this is ultimately to overcome a bias that we say, if all you see out of your window is a car, suddenly everything ends up looking like a drive. Now, what if, instead of, I'm afraid, the world's top supermodels serving champagne on the train, and Rory, I checked and it wasn't in today's rail plan.
No.
We did what we could. Instead of this, we had the world's top novelists, the world's top authors and presenters recording audiobooks timed to someone's location so they could describe fascinating stories and trivia and novels that they can look out of right outside the window. Wouldn't that be so achievable and so easy to do? So each chapter in part 2 finishes with some suggested reading, and we hope the whole book really acts as a primer. There's so much to say on all of these topics, but it acts as both a starter for anybody interested in the discipline and also a place to go to look further. So part 3 is a section of which, to be honest, I think I'm most proud, and I hope is most influential, and something that does go a little bit deeper and cuts to the heart of many of the things Rory has written over the years. It gets to the root cause of transport as a human endeavor. It does this by turning attention to the psychological influences about that influence the people who design, manufacture, and plan transport. It talks about the decisions they make, the data, crucially, that they have available to make those decisions, and how they frame the problem to be solved. There are 4 chapters here, each about high-stakes decisions. So one about the trap of focusing on quantified metrics, that crux of engineering and economics, that could be balanced better by developing ways to track more human metrics. A second piece about what we call the tyranny of averages, the fact that we measure populations rather than people. We so often know the ridership numbers of many millions of people, but very little about the travel habits of a given person, and how that plays into what we design and the fairness and equity aspects. A third point is called over-optimism. Behavioral scientists will be familiar with the optimism bias. It's been studied quite extensively in infrastructure investment, and it finds there are some iron laws of overrunning on time and in budget that are very prescient, especially around new technologies like electric and driverless cars, among many other big investments. Fourthly, and this is a chapter I think that would be very deficient in the book were it not in, a chapter we call groupthink, but is broadly about broadening the diversity in decision-making, addressing some of the conformity biases people have when they're faced with big, high-stakes decisions, for sure, but also really getting a broader set and representative set of people in the room to make those decisions. Something that needs to happen and is exemplified by 2 quotes. When we all think alike, no one thinks very much. And a broader movement of nothing about us without us. So some of these parts in chapter 3, in part 3, are quite lofty. I hope that many readers get something from it. If you want my hot take, I would say if you get nothing else, there's a lot about high speed 2 and a great section on Concorde that I loved researching and I hope you love reading. It's titled Concorde, the Tyrannosaurus Rex of Extinct Transport. It's a marvel of engineering, but it could not survive in a human world. And I think this is very prescient for the 21st century and perhaps even the 22nd century. So in the book, we give 3 visions for a human transport future. We call them the ABCs of transport design: to adapt, to be more balanced, and to harness our consciousness. Now, in this launch, I'll give you just one, and I'll pick the middle one because I think it applies to all of us, really. So the bit about balance is coming back to the point about a bit less quantity of travel, a bit more quality of travel, but extending that thought to say, wouldn't an achievable future be people thriving on more healthy, balanced diets as transport options? Just like our nutrition, people thrive on healthier, balanced diets. Currently, people have a narrow range of travel habits, and they are ending up in the world we're living in, dependent on just a few modes. We say these are the fast food diets of transport. A brighter future will see people enjoying a healthier set and really a menu of options. So some of this looks like our search engines going from black and white hierarchies of metrics, really based on speed and price, to a much broader menu of options that helps us decide what's right for us at that time and for other people. So our sat navs and maps might be context specific. They might show and know what roads to use based on our needs and those of other people. It's a striking statistic that, did you know, London's roads in the past 10 years, their traffic, despite car ownership remaining completely stable, has increased 70%, all on smaller roads, and in large part tracking the adoption of sat navs, which facilitate that. Sometimes transport makes things easier for us, but sometimes there are some fast food options that it sends us towards. So for this future to exist, we completely accept, and coming back to the yes and point, transport providers, governments and private companies will have worked tirelessly and invested heavily in greater frequency and in engineering. But social researchers will have put together more people-centered data, and behavioral scientists will have addressed some of these so what policy considerations of the day, sometimes making the case for what people would want, and sometimes being a tool or a method for getting there. In wider society, we hope people will have gained the skills that make them more fluent in traveling in more ways. Now, I passionately believe, in fact, that one point that is note of the book is that I think, if nothing else, the science of understanding behavior would benefit us all. And there's a common language behind our travel experiences that could make us a little bit more humble when we jump to hasty conclusions about how to best get from A to B. There's often a lot more choice than we realize. So I'll finish with a question that I have been getting many times. So, Pete, are we nearly there yet? Now, I've already described I'm an optimist, and we're saying we are on our way. Are we nearly there yet? And Transport for Humans has some inputs. So behavioral science is great at diagnosing the problems at the moment, and it can use theory and models to say why people are doing things. But it's helpful in the future to build a more common language for people and non-specialists. It's still got some way to go to have the full potential of a method, and a scientific method of answering those tough questions. So what should we invest in? Why? For whom? Why should we invest here rather than here? And as I've described through a small example from EVs, there are emerging ways to do that. But Transport for Humans should also be an output and a destination. And ultimately, that's what you and I really care about. Now, we think we could achieve the first wave of fixes in this day-to-day passenger problems in just a few years. But realistically, the second wave of rethinking and rebalancing transport policy and the assumptions we make might well take decades. And to that extent, we should be patient. Now, if you take nothing else from this talk, it's that Transport for Humans is one journey that would be significantly improved if we cut the time it took to get from A to B. Thank you very much. Rory, what do you make of all this?
I think it's really interesting to ask why it is that people who are interested in complexity theory, find transport so interesting, because it starts off as a complex system to begin with knock-on effects and feedback loops and everything else. But then when you add the additional question of psychology to it, it's a bit like 3D chess. And I think there's something, there's a particular kind of mindset which finds travel planning, transport planning fascinating, partly because I think it's also full of counterintuitive and unexpected things. For example, in any transport network, if everybody adopts the optimal journey, it's not good news, it's actually bad. You want people to have highly varied preferences. Because if everybody, and this is something that really worries me, which is that most transport apps assume you are overwhelmingly preoccupied with speed and price. And as a result, what they'll start to do is create behaviors which then lead transport analysts to believe that all people care about is speed and price, because that's the choice architecture they've been given. If you look at airline booking, for example, I mean, you couldn't launch an airline that gave you an extra 4 inches of legroom and charged £30 more, even though a large number of people would like it, because if you did that, you wouldn't even get onto the first 5 pages of Skyscanner. No one would know of the existence of your flight. And so if you look at most airline websites, they just assume all you're interested in is basically, speed, price. And then if you make people, of course, more similar in their preferences, you actually make the network, the system overall, vastly less effective. So, one alternative to building a new east-west rail line or underground rail line is simply to actually, well, one of the things you could do is you could have multiple tube maps. Now, that sounds really weird, doesn't it? This is one of the things that fascinates me, that if you only have one tube map, there are inherent biases in map design. So the central line is red, and it goes in a straight line from right to left. So it's immediately very, very salient and very obvious, if you want to get from east to west, that the central line is a great thing. So as a result, too many people use the central line simply as a product of the map design relative to, say, going on the circle line and enjoying the air conditioning. Okay.
I can pitch in and say the Santiago Metro in Chile has studied exactly this and found that map users do find there is an angular cost, as they call it.
So the Victoria line, which is probably the best line on the tube map, because it was added last, goes in a ridiculous curve. It doesn't go in a stupid curve, okay, in reality, geographically. But to fit it onto the existing map, they had to put a massive great curve in it. I actually lived, we used to travel into Victoria Station for 20 years before I realized that the Victoria line went from Victoria to Euston. Because if you look at the map, no one's looking at a map going, I wonder if there's a really kind of, deviant, strange and circuitous way of getting between these 2 points. So the Victoria line, which is the best line probably, is underused. Now, if you extend that with an app, which is purely optimizing along 1 or 2 presumed metrics, you create this self-fulfilling prophecy problem, which is you start to believe that the things you're prioritizing are what people care about. And so, there are a whole load of things that sat-navs don't actually let you choose on. If you get, I always wondered if there's a sat-nav setting, if your wife was making you go somewhere you didn't want to go, which would deliberately drive you into hideous traffic so you'd arrive at the party really late. That's probably a bit extreme, okay? But there's nothing about scenery. The entire thing is, there's nothing on variance either, which is quite often humans ignore their sat-nav because they go, I don't want to miss the flight. Therefore, I'd rather go on a slower road where it'll probably take 20 minutes longer rather than going on a motorway where I'll get there 20 minutes faster on average, but one time in 20, I'll get stuck for an hour. So we have a whole bunch of things that we instinctively use when we make human decisions. Things like optionality, for example, and variance reduction, which are really important to us. We instinctively understand them. Many people here probably have taken a route where you prefer a slower route where you keep moving to a faster route when you're actually stationary for a long period. The level of frustration of a train delay is much, much greater if you're stationary than if you're just rumbling along very slowly. But none of these things get factored into models. And when you look at it, it's really interesting. There's a bit of a bonus prize here. Does anybody know the only scientific unit that factors human perception in at all? Anyone know? It's actually the lumen, okay? Because the lumen is the only SI unit or SI-derived unit that it can't just be light intensity. It has to be light intensity in the human visible spectrum. Because otherwise you could produce really efficient light bulbs that produced a whole ton of ultraviolet light, and the finance people would go and buy them immediately, because okay, and then everybody would be walking around bumping into the furniture, right? So the lumen actually takes account of what humans perceive. There's no other measure takes account of any perceptual thing. The Americans have that one exceptional thing, don't they, which is feels like. You may have noticed that with American weather forecasts, which I rather like, because obviously if it's less humid, it feels cooler, for example. If there's a breeze, it feels cooler. So the Americans understand that temperature is a subjective thing. It's not purely a scientific thing. But what tends to happen is that the quest to make everything, if you look at most of those units, they were designed not for their relevance to humanity, but for their aid to calculation. And so what engineers do is they assume that transport optimization is all about objective improvement of things, despite the fact that the correlation between objective improvement and human enjoyment or propensity to travel is very, very non-linear, and in some cases is perhaps the opposite of what you might expect. I think it might be you, it might be Douglas McWilliams. Someone has evidence that you can prove that people choose to live further away from work than actually makes sense, because they prefer psychologically to be at a kind of mental distance from their place of work as a kind of buffer. And, there are journeys which are actually too short, because if the ratio of dicking around to actually traveling, short-haul air travel, the ratio of dicking around to actually traveling is particularly silly, then people find it actually more frustrating than they, so people actually, to be honest, people used to take the Eurostar to Paris rather than flying, even when the Eurostar took significantly longer. And so we're optimizing around the wrong things. And then the thing that really worries me is we're designing travel software, whether it's flight booking software or travel apps or London transport apps, which presume the same thing. And so as a result, we're exacerbating the problem still further, because the only information we give people is what we think they should prioritize. And so I find this just a really interesting case. I think Dave Snowden, who's somewhere at the back, calls it anthrocomplexity, which is complexity, which factors in human psychology and perception. And so if you're interested in anthro-complexity and the distinction between what rationally people should prefer or choose and how they should experience things and how they really perceive things, I think this is just an absolutely fascinating kind of area for test arguments, for understanding that.
I mean, something I'd add, and I think is worth mentioning today with respect to fast-moving trains, is in a yes and approach. There's very many ways in which you would want the trains to run faster. But I think in the book we have several perspectives that says while you're doing that and spend lots of time doing that, also work out how can you make the check-in experience as you get onto the Eurostar a little bit less than 45 minutes. How can you...
Do you know the thing that really pisses me off is fucking preparing train like it's a bloody cake. You know that Euston Station? You get there, I don't care if the train's late. I just want to sit on the train, get my plugs out and get sorted, right? I don't care if the damn thing's stationary for an hour once I'm sitting in my arse and they're bringing me buns, okay? I don't care. But they put this sign up, preparing train. And basically what that means is you're going to stand around like a dickhead, you know, while we do some unspecified activity. And so understand, you know, to be honest, I mean, those things are really weird because, I mean, you made the point when you talked about high speed too, that A, they made a mistake making it all about speed when it was partly about capacity. But also everybody talks about journey time, every single debate. But there are other questions, like, for example, how frequent are the trains? Because there's a huge difference. If you live, you know, if you live somewhere where we decided it was somewhere around 15 to 20 minutes, didn't we? But if you have a 15 to 20 minute frequency of a bus or a train, it becomes like the tube. People don't really have to follow a timetable. Once you get out to 30 minutes, you've got to catch a specific train. And that means you've got to allow a greater margin of error when you go to the station, which adds to journey time further. So one crazy thing, you build a high-speed 2 line, okay, where the trains go at immense speed. They may be leaving every 5 minutes. But if the pricing or ticketing basically says, if you don't catch the train you booked the day before, you void the amount of money you spent on your pre-booked ticket and you have to pay the full fare all over again, okay? Then actually everybody's going to turn up at Euston 40 minutes early for fear of missing their designated train, which actually eradicates half the time savings you spent 80 billion to achieve. And so not understanding these dimensions, I mean, I think it might have been you, Paul, who made the point that actually the claim that you need a new line up to Manchester because of overcrowding is slightly undermined by the fact that most of the overcrowding is caused by the pricing mechanism. So the trains that are overcrowded are typically the first off-peak train of the day, okay? So if you just actually built in a smoother gradation of pricing, you'd have solved that problem anyway. So this is really, really interesting because it's where engineering and psychology, which should be actually bedfellows, have been effectively trying to solve problems in complete isolation from each other.
Yeah, and I think they can help improve the quality of conversation. And I think when you spend more time looking at how people use transport, you do start digesting news a little bit differently. I mean, questions that I'm keen to ask is, I mean, how can we think for the future of having live meeting rooms on trains and office meeting rooms at stations and a seamless experience of people dialing in and working as they go? We in the book talk about it rather than being a very fast way to get to an office, is it a very fast moving office? And how bookable is that space? I mean, I'm saying it now, but is 58 minutes too short as a train ride because you want a 1 hour slot? We don't know.
And Euston Station is an extraordinarily appalling space, isn't it? I mean, you'd be better off if you saved the money on high speed 2, just demolished Euston Station and left it like a Wild West station, like High Noon or like Once Upon a Time in the West, you know, where you stood outside and caught the train.
Well, it used to have a very ornate arch,
yeah,
which ended up in a canal near where I live in East London.
But it's very interesting that the first thing the accountants cut from high speed 2 was the improvement of Euston Station, which, to be honest, might have made a far greater difference to people's actual enjoyment of the journey.
If I might turn it on its head as well, I mean, there's many things to lament about transport infrastructure, and the UK has a long history of it, and sometimes we're sort of locked into the infrastructure we built 100 or 200 years ago, and we'd have it a lot easier if we were out on a blank slate now. But it's always going to be that way, and really it's worth thinking of these things more as a biological system. And if we think about transport for humans, let's think about our transport system in our own bodies, blood, nervous system, lymphatic system, bones. These transport different things around, but they're also often in competition.
Yeah.
And through a process of evolution, we carry with us all sorts of peculiar mishmash, vestibular pieces here and strange things in our esophagus there. And we're destined to always kind of suffer with those things. It's not really necessarily an optimization problem.
No.
If we think of it more as an evolutionary system, and this is where I'd love to get to in the conclusion, let's think about what behavior selects for different transport. Let's think about like what positive signals we send. And in the long term, okay, maybe not all transport suddenly gets made perfect, but if we can set up a system where at least the good stuff can thrive, then we get closer and closer to a system that gets closer to people.
And by the way, one thing which we'd be absolutely agreed on, I'm probably a bit more pro car than you are, etc. Or at least I'm more fatalistic about, I think people just really like owning cars. Okay. And I think it's a bit of a problem in that once you've owned a car, it sets your expectation of autonomy and it resets it at a new level. Whereafter, it's very easy for young people who don't own cars to go, cars are terrible, public transport's the future. The tragedy is that may be true, but once you've actually owned one, your expectation of autonomy gets recalibrated. And then suddenly sacrificing a car feels impossible. It's one of those things a bit like a mobile phone. A lot of people didn't want one, but very few people who actually got one then reverted. I don't know anybody, in fact. And so, I'm a little more, but one thing I think is true is that if we get people to have a more varied diet, it doesn't have to be massively, this can actually be, to some extent, temporary nudges. I think in Denmark, you get free rail travel on your birthday. Okay, which was a bit annoying because I gave a presentation to Danish Rail and there was a long build up to say why you should give people free travel on their birthday, to which they replied, we already do that. So don't be feeling a bit stupid. But the point is that if you get people to try things 3 or 4 times, okay, they are now making, someone who never makes a train journey is effectively using their car as a default mode. It's unthinking. They're not really thinking very much about it. You can get them to make 4 car. I mean, one of my suggestions was make car tax quite high, but give people rail vouchers as a kind of rebate. Okay, because if people make 4 or 5 rail journeys a year, the first 4 are always the most difficult. It's like the first 3 times you do online grocery shopping, right? It'd be easier to crawl to the supermarket over broken glass. Okay. But the 5th time, it becomes a little bit easy, a little bit fluid, a little bit natural, and you discover what the benefits are. You suddenly realize, oh, when I'm on the train, I can get on with some work or watch a film, which doesn't occur to you in advance. And so nudging people into just a greater variety of a bigger repertoire will have huge knock-on benefits, which will actually be quite sticky, I think. And I think there are a huge number of people who have, about 50% of the population are outright rail rejectors. I think that's about right, isn't it?
In a given year in the UK, 60% of the population take a train.
Take a train, okay. Yeah, there's a significant group. If you do it very infrequently, there's another problem. If you use the railways very infrequently, it will tend to be Christmas, Easter, which is when they do all their engineering works. So the infrequent train user very rapidly comes to the conclusion that the railway network is shit. Whereas if you actually go on a working Wednesday, you actually find it's quite idyllic. So understanding these problems at the individual level, but also this business of, so the 2 things are actually encouraging people to be, to effectively have a more balanced diet. Once you've experienced the whole range of transport things, then quite often your decisions will be quite intelligent and quite nuanced. But actually, we generally don't choose to do things we've never done before. There's a kind of obstacle there. And then the second, I suppose, the other element that really interests me, I think, the other element is don't solve for the average. And I was on the, one very interesting thing is the way in which what you tend to do is you assume that individual travelers are fungible, okay? And therefore you imagine this single representative individual, okay, who's kind of homo transporticus, and you solve for them, completely failing to realize that actually, the reason people make journeys is wildly different, and what they want from a journey can be hugely, hugely different. Okay, and maybe, by the way, they're often actually the reasons they give for their choice of journey is actually untrue. It's a post-rationalization of an emotional predisposition. But solving for the average is terrible. I mean, one of the worst things, if you look at it, is increasingly rail users will be elderly. And if you go to London Bridge, where they spent 500 million or something at London Bridge Station, you couldn't imagine worse lavatory provision. I'm 56, it's a problem to me after I've had a couple of pints, okay? So what it's like when you're 75 and you've got Crohn's disease, God only knows, right? But the extent to which actually the railways make a very bad job of catering to anybody, the moment you deviate from a very, lazily presumed norm, and actually rail travel disproportionately, I think, appeals to people at the extremes.
Yep.
It appeals to people who can't afford a car. It appeals to people who are too busy to drive. And so this extent where you solve for the average, I think, strikes me as it's a natural propensity of models to do it. It seems terribly dangerous.
It is, yeah. I mean, they're models, but we should be sympathetic that there is the computing power available for these. But it's about getting the quality in, really. And there's lots of cross-sectional work that asks 1,000 people, how did you travel today? But it picks them off the string. But there's a lot less on what people call longitudinal data of tracking a person or many people for quite a long time and seeing how their behavior changes, which is why behavioral scientists get deliriously excited about longitudinal panel studies. But we finally get a chance to look at people rather than whole populations, and that guides the decisions of so many decisions of how people are using things.
The other thing that's really interesting is this ergodicity question, which we bring up a few times, which is most models that effectively mathematicize and averagize the traveller don't make the distinction between 1,000 people saving an hour once and one person saving an hour 1,000 times. Now, we would argue that the investment in short-range journeys that people make very frequently leads to significant behavioural change. If you look at High Speed 1, okay, if you live in Canterbury, that changes your life. Now means you can work in London, okay? High Speed 2, you might argue, it actually saves more people time, but something that actually saves you a couple of hours 10 times a year isn't actually that important in behavioural terms, even though the time saving looks identical as far as the model goes. And that's why we argue the Concorde was ultimately a failure. First of all, it doesn't work travelling from west to east, because actually you want an overnight flight when you're going back. But secondly, because nobody travelled enough on the Concorde for actually that time saving to significantly add to their free time.
No,
he didn't. I worked it out, okay. Basically, the guy who travelled on the Concordes the most of anybody, who was on the first ever flight and the last ever flight. And bear in mind, this guy was a nutter. I mean, he was on it, more or less every few weeks. And we worked out that per working day, the Concorde saved him about 10 minutes, okay? So instead of developing $1 billion aircraft, you could have just got him to set his alarm a bit early. It's not, I mean, what I'm saying is it's not, that if you look at the time saving per individual, nobody used it, even Sorrell used it enough really to make it.
It wasn't so much criteria, it was a club. So it was a club where everyone sat in the same seat, you knew who was in each seat.
Yeah.
It had actually changed the variable, actually the time was nice. And actually meeting and being able to talk to whatever Lord Sainsbury or whatever, because he's sat in seat 3 and Martin was in seat
And of course, because the seating is totally inadequate, you're actually shoulder to shoulder with these people rather than being across an aisle. Yeah. I mean, having said that, there are cheaper ways of achieving that effect, like arresting them all and putting them in the same prison. But yeah, no, I accept that fact that it had a value completely incidental to its transport.
In a way, vote for that as well.
Before we just go to questions, I'll only add on speed, and I know a lot of we make a lot about speed from going from A to B. I'd only say that transport really needs to engage with these wider points in the social world about why we have deadlines and why you need to be at a certain place at a certain time. That's from work start at 9 a.m. for everyone, and there's a compulsion if you're 5 minutes late, well, that's a red mark against you. Why a hospital appointment set at you must be there at a certain time, that then means less reliable modes of travel get thrown out the window. Can't we look at why we really need to vary our bodies from place to place? And it would be great to talk to schools, workplaces, and everywhere that sort of compels people to be there at a certain time, to say maybe Martin Sorrell's meeting didn't need to be at that time, in which case it'd have, a press.
You have a very bizarre thing, don't you, where people have extraordinarily different expectations of punctuality. So people would be pissed off if a train arrives 5 minutes late, despite the fact that if you'd made the same journey by car, you would have had to allow 40 minutes buffer. And yet for some reason, because it's train, there's an expectation, a completely different expectation of punctuality.
Maddie, you see we have some questions.
Yeah, we've got a few coming in from the live stream. There's a question here, like, why aren't these things happening in the UK? And what do you think is holding the UK back when it comes to optimizing the travel?
Okay. Well, in the book, I would say you've got to write about what you we've got to write about what you know about, and our city, closest city being London. It is heavily on examples there, and you'll see it replete with certainly work from Transport for London as an operator, although you could say many other city operators doing a lot of great work. I mean, what's holding us back, I would say some of these are just root cause issues. Some of them you wonder whether someone has done a walkthrough from a passenger's perspective. But other ones, it's talking about the data that we get in, how we can empower and help transport infrastructure actually make the human case to say, this is really worthwhile, connecting these places would be fabulous for the following reasons. That's what we're passionate about moving to.
The UK probably does have a problem in that it is obsessed with accountability and quantification and metrics in some forms of decision making, even when the metrics are very poorly correlated with what people care about. And that does strike me as a bit of a UK problem. So an interesting case in Transport for London, for example, it's very, very difficult for them to make the business case for better bus or tube information. Now, people are inordinately happier waiting for a bus if they know when the next bus is coming. They're inordinately happier. They'd rather wait 9 minutes for a tube knowing there's one coming in 9 minutes than wait 4 minutes in a state of uncertainty. But because information doesn't change the objective characteristics of a journey, speed and duration, the business case is very, very difficult to make. Now, I would argue more people would take the bus if there were adequate bus information. Therefore, you make more money from buses. But they don't have a model, weirdly, that allows them to actually make that justification. So it's far, far easier spending money on a new set of points that makes a journey 3 minutes quicker than it is to spend money on something that makes waiting less annoying.
Yeah.
I mean, the total inadequacy of seating, total inadequacy of toilet provision, things that really, really matter and are deal breakers to people. There is a solution, by the way. If you are bothered by the loo, this is a radar key which gets you access to the disabled toilets at stations. eBay, £3.50. And that's why I work for the private sector and Pete's in the public sector. But there you go, I'll park on that one. But the point I'm making is that things that people really care about, for which there isn't a metric, like quality of seating, for example, get completely overlooked. You can't make the case.
I would be happy to take the flak and say, hey, behavioral scientists, get on with it. People that know about this say discrete choice experiments, online studies, field trials. Let's put it out there, make it easy to do, and start helping make the case and say, what's it worth to have a table seat? What's it worth to people to have cleaner windows? What's it worth to do these things? And I think if we could make it cheaper, easier, more rigorous, straightforward to do, there's no bits of steel holding us back from running these trials a lot and learning
Isn't
what
the
works.
bottom line of it, back to what Rory says, isn't the fact that, for your lovely title, Transport Humans, isn't the fact that the world is moving against you because the world is becoming more behaviourally segmented. There's more and more people with very, very different travel needs. In the last 2 years, even more. And so therefore, to your point, isn't the average the thing that's going to really screw you up every time? Because basically all these great ideas will work. There's more and more compartmentalized needs, which are working against TfL and many other organizations like you.
Yeah, I think for sure. It's always any decision will have to have trade-offs and compromises because you're working in the world. So lots of scarcity there. Without nuking the conversation, data is pretty much the forefront. Is going to say how much do different companies know about us? How much does our phone service provider know where we go? And is that connected with the bus service or with our car apps or with where we spend our money? I mean, these aren't questions that we would say of where these things should be connected. But until you know what connects, and you're not really going to be able to solve these things for average challenges.
It's also an inherent problem in any monopoly, and a lot of transport problems are monopolies, which is that the market information feedback loop doesn't really operate adequately. So, you know, in a completely competitive environment, what would happen is new competitors would come in and they'd optimize completely different variables. And sometimes they'd succeed and sometimes they'd fail. And as a result of that process, you eventually learn what people want. You even learn what people didn't even know they wanted, which is the kind of Red Bull miracle. No one was there saying, why isn't there a really expensive, disgusting tasting drink? Okay. But it just turns out that there's a market for that, even though no one would have stated their preference for that in advance. And so markets as a mechanism often uncover hidden preferences and surprisingly illogical value sets, and also cater for a variety of value sets. You know, it's assumed, you know, and I had a very interesting conversation in the Sevenoaks Rail Travellers Association, which had their meeting, where most of the concern was, you know, about lavatory provision, because most of the people in that organisation are quite elderly, perfectly reasonable concern. Now, the interesting assumption I noticed was on a given train route, you either had lavatories on the train or you didn't. Okay. Now there is a solution. Most of those elderly people are travelling to some extent with some degree of discretion, and you could put toilet facilities on one train in three. But the mentality of both, I suppose, the public sector a bit and monopolies is that you're solving for an average person, a single representative agent, and so something's either right or it's wrong. Now, you know, what you could have done is, particularly with better information, you could go, okay, we will try and put toilets on one train in 4, and, you know, with a reasonable frequency, that solves the problems for the people who care. But that mentality, there's a mentality of uniformity of provision. It's what Tony Blair was kind of up against in the NHS, which is that the idea of fairness means you have to offer everybody the same thing. The problem is when people have different preferences, offering everybody the same thing is actually unfair, because the level of service you enjoy is proportionate simply to how close you are to the assumed norm. And so people who are elderly or people with children generally get very badly looked at. You know, anybody who's got an unusual circumstance gets very badly looked after in those kind of settings.
I'm assuming the Sevenoaks people have all now got a key.
Yeah, well, I didn't actually share my tricks, because I like to keep it myself, but just between us. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, but surely what I experience, having been involved in not mostly cars, as Rory knows, but also I'm mad about trains, is that the human aspect of your book is that actually people aren't treated as humans. Your idea that on trains with cargo is absolutely feeds into everything we've just been discussing. And certainly in my world where cars are being regulated, motorists are treated with complete contempt by every government department I deal with, including your own. And it is assumed that they're opportunists who are out to pull a fast one.
Yeah.
And they want to game the system. And every kind of provision that is made in relation to people in vehicles really is there to try and stop gaming and to try and spend a lot of time trying to see whether they can avoid people actually taking any kind of advantage. And this is not treating people as humans. I wouldn't have said in terms of understanding behaviour and who people are. And this strikes me as being a fundamental problem.
I might argue that actually the rail networks have become better at that, in fairness, in that the quality of information provision is much better than it was 10, 20 years ago. Generally, the level of courtesy and helpfulness of rail staff, which in my childhood in the 70s was unbelievably bad. It was effectively, you know, you were treated, you know, as if you were an inconvenience to the smooth operating of the trains, effectively. So I would say there is progress in certain things. The provision of, of automatic ticketing has got better. I mean, there are some fairly good improvements there. We shouldn't totally despair. But I agree with you in terms of the extent to which there is, you've created a system where there's no benefit of the doubt. So if you overstay your parking by 5 minutes, or if you, for example, you miss a train on which you have a pre-booked ticket, you instantly enter miscreant territory. There's no kind of, okay, well, we'll assume this was an honest mistake. You automatically get treated as if you've committed an offence. And I think that there's something deeply inhuman about that. And that thing that, you know, if you miss your pre-booked train, not only do you have to pay absolutely full fare for the following train, but that the money you spent on your previous ticket is void. Nearly everybody would find that instinctively unjust and unfair, I think. That, you know, now some concession made there, in whatever kind of concession, would make a huge difference to people's emotional experience. Because what you possibly do there is, in a large number of people, you create a large amount of never again, you know. And so, yeah, what you, I mean, I would point to some improvements. I mean, I would say that, you know, certain aspects of rail travel have got quite a bit better. But the extent to which there's a kind of a slightly nanny-ish attitude is interesting.
Yeah, it's less my area of expertise, but I suppose you need to zoom out and ask what penalties, fines, jurisdiction is trying to do. And some of this comes back to what behavior it's trying to change. I mean, why we might have taxes on some things, penalties on others. You might question how effective they are as behavior change methods, or how much they are needed for other things. So yeah, it's hard to sort of square that one off, or in general. I'm conscious we've had just one question online. Are there any others to share?
Yeah, there's quite a few coming in. So another one is, do you think people will start prioritising the environment over journey time? Or do you think population's main incentive will always be an individual one?
What was the last one again? What do you think?
Do you think people will start prioritising the environment over journey time?
Yeah.
Or do you think it'll always be like a personal incentive that people are looking to do?
Well, my view would be that in many cases, electric cars will be a clear case of this. Having bought an electric car for selfish reasons, they will start to prioritise the environment in their treatment of other people. So there's going to be, I think there's going to be a degree of, one of the useful insights of behavioural science is that actually in many cases behavioural change precedes attitudinal change. So the standard assumption is you convert people into environmentalists and they buy electric cars. Actually, it quite often works in reverse. You buy an electric car and you find yourself taunting all your petrol engine friends for killing polar bears all of a sudden, even though 2 months before it had never been even remotely one of your preoccupations. So I think it will. I also think, by the way, I mean, it's interesting, a fairly large amount of business travel was not actually voluntary. It was an obligation. So I think we have I'm very interested in the extent to which when you change a social norm, suddenly behavior changes a lot and sticks. So the way I describe it is that in 2018, okay, and you had a 2-hour meeting in Frankfurt, okay? In 2018, flying to Frankfurt was kind of Coke, and having a video conference was kind of Dr. Pepper. You know, that was when you're a bit of a weirdo and you were part of the awkward squad, and you know, and if you suggested a video conference and it went wrong, everybody blamed you for not flying to Frankfurt, okay? You know, now what happened, I think, after you had this enforced period of change is that kind of the video call would now be Coke and flying to Frankfurt would be Dr. Pepper. And so the extent to which I think there are tipping points in behavior where a fairly large amount of business travel, I think, was socially normative, was performative, if you like. It was done to show you cared, because, you know, having a video call when you were supposed to fly to Frankfurt kind of made it look as if you were rude or you couldn't be bothered. It was like, what I always say is like dressing for dinner in the 19th century. You had to do it because everybody else did it, you know. And I think it's interesting that it's worth noting that not all consumption is actually voluntary. It's often driven by social expectations.
I'll quickly add, sometimes it can be controversial to talk about, should we be traveling less, traveling differently? I mean,
we already are, by the way. It was worth mentioning that one of the things the book points out is that before COVID, and actually before the financial crisis, I think, average driver miles in the UK were trending downwards. Train travel was going up a little bit, but commuting was going down.
Yeah.
So nearly all transport planning was on the basis of these extrapolations from continued growth, which weren't really true. People were driving less, they were commuting less.
I mean, yeah, and there's this difference between when you talk about shall we travel less, as though you would want to go somewhere, but you would be held back from it, right? I think there's probably a great domain of area that's probably worth looking at, of all the trips people didn't even want to take in the first place. Lots of people will say, oh, great, thanks, that saved me a trip. Oh, thanks, I didn't have to do that.
I mean,
there's lots of times we travel that we really would rather we could solve it by
the
other
Zoom
means.
wedding was a classic dilemma, wasn't it? Okay, but pre-Zoom wedding, which is someone gets married overseas, you had two choices: spend a goddamn fortune, basically take 4 days off work and spend half of those 4 days in a bloody airport, or look like a bastard and not go at all. And actually the ability to attend those kind of things remotely as a halfway house is hugely valuable. And it's really, it wasn't that it was technologically impossible before, it was that it was socially impossible. And I remember about this before COVID, I asked about 10 very, very frequent travelers, just as a thought experiment. I said, if you could kind of sign a pledge which your employer would respect, you know, not to fly for 9 months of every year, how would you react? And all but one of them said, actually, they're older, bear in mind, young people are slightly more enthusiastic about whooping it up, but they're all older people. And actually all but one of them said, well, secretly, I'd be delighted. You know, I'd claim it was for environmental reasons, but really it was selfish.
I think we've got time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions.
Okay.
I mean, electric cars, by the way, are just really cool. I mean, you know, forget about it. I mean, that's not a bad thing, you know, because there's always a danger that the environmental solution is sold as a kind of hair-shirted, you know, act of self-sacrifice. And of course, it's worth noting that a lot of these things needn't be like that. You know, you can have less of better, for example, is one way you can maintain economic growth while reducing overall consumption. And, you know, I mean, you know, we have to be fairly grateful to Musk because he actually made the point that actually an electric car in many ways is just better than the gasoline equivalent.
Okay, another question from the, oh, we've got one in the room.
Yeah. Well.
That's good. So presumably you haven't written this for the average reader. So who do you most want to read the book?
I would hope that it does find its way, and it could be on the bookshelf of a Minister for Transport or a Chief Executive or an operator of any company, that they might want to read it anywhere around the world. Who do I want to most read it? Anyone in 10 years' time, because it will then therefore still be relevant. There you go.
Perfect.
First off, great book, great title, and lovely content. Just a quick question. Are we at risk of over-optimizing in our travels? You talked earlier about, well, why don't we turn a train into an office environment? So you convert that time to something constructive and efficient. And with the driverless vehicles, that'll come along as well. So you have a car that can be optimized into an office environment. And with COVID, my home is now an office.
Yeah.
Work is
and now your German train is an office. Yeah.
Train is an office. At what point should we be less obsessed with uptime and be more obsessed with
Totally valid point, because there's quite a lot of evidence that people enjoy their commute as valuable staring time. And that it's actually a buffer between work and home, and that they like staring into space because it's what we've evolved to do in many ways. And I think that also comes down to the whole question of far greater choice, because we tend to design for this weird average. And I would argue that I agree with you that, you know, there are times when a train is an office, and there are times when it's a scenic railway, and actually train design could make far more use of this. I mean, I always used to find the Eurostar a bit annoying, because basically they gave you quite an elaborate breakfast and a slightly shambolic dinner on the way home, right? Now, what I actually wanted is I was working on the way out. So I wanted a bacon roll on the way out. Of course, they're French, so they're incapable of actually heating breakfast above room temperature. But I wanted a bacon roll on the way out so I could use my laptop. On the way back, I'd finished my meeting and I wanted the finest wines known to humanity, you know. But they had this kind of average experience. And of course, the journey out and the journey back are two totally different experiences in terms of what you want from them.
Yeah. It's a great question. I agree about your where's society heading. It's a really good one. There's a thing called the Instrumented Passenger Project run by Newcastle University, and it looked at southeastern railways. And it started using eye tracking and seeing how and heart rate monitors and other tracking to see what's actually going on when someone sits on that train on their commute or on their leisure journey. And it has some fascinating reports. One thing that I've been minded to know is that what people say in surveys is not necessarily what the report comes out as. And the data shows people, again, have a repertoire of things that they do on that journey. Some of it is checking their phone, some of it's looking out the window, some of it's sleeping a bit, then it's a bit of working. You know, even a given journey has a lot of variation in it. And it's kind of the brilliance of it all. Maybe transport could be more modular and have different sections in different places you go to.
One big thing I did say to the Transport for London people, as I said, I mean, one thing COVID might have given you is we've actually got a first-class tube network at a cost of nothing, simply by changing people's behaviour. Okay, so when we talk about flexible working, everybody talks about 3-2 and whatever it might be. One very simple part of flexible working is maybe people work from home a bit and then travel in on an off-peak train later in the morning. Okay, now if you can then work on that train, the argument is you're actually better off commuting in on an empty train where you can work than traveling in at 9 o'clock. I always used to get annoyed occasionally when people at work said, I got into work really early this morning because I had a lot of emails to send. I used to go, you haven't really grasped this internet thing, have you? You could have done them last night, or you could have done them from home if they were that urgent. Okay, and so one great thing we should look at is anything you can do to foster diverse use of the rail in terms of time of day. Because, I mean, if you look at it, the London commuter rail network, and to some extent the tube, is optimized around a very peculiar behavioral habit, which is everybody having to get in at 9 o'clock. Now, if you can just break that down and make the morning a bit more like the evening, where there's a much broader shoulder of travel, largely caused by the consumption of alcoholic drinks, I think. Okay, but we're not, not everybody rushes at the train at 5 o'clock and immediately tries to get on, but that does basically happen in the morning peak. If you can actually just spread out those shoulder periods, it's an enormous increase in efficiency and environmental improvement and everything else. Because what we have is, we had a network of commuter rail, which was basically moving fresh air around the countryside for about 5 hours a day. And so actually, that's another reason you don't just want people to be diverse in terms of what they use the train for, you want them to be diverse in terms of which routes they choose, and diverse in terms of what time of day they use it. Because that was the problem with trains. There's nothing wrong with trains, except that everybody tries to use them at the same time. I mean, I would argue one of the best ways you can become wealthier without earning more money is simply having more free when. I don't mean free time, but free when. In other words, if you're free to do things at a different time to other people, there's a whole group of people who work night shifts who never go back because they find the freedom to basically shop when shops are empty, go to pubs when they're empty, is actually worth more than rubies. And so if we give people, I think what happened, partly during COVID, was people discovered they didn't necessarily want more free time, but a degree of autonomy over when and where you worked was valuable in and of itself. And of course, that never factored into labor economics, which was all about the reason your pay is called compensation is that in labor economics, you're given money to compensate you for your loss of leisure. It's simply a two-way exchange. And now, actually, I did say to all employers 2 things, okay? One, don't just ask whether you want your employees to be able to work flexibly. There's a bigger question. Do you want your customers to be able to work flexibly? Because if they can, they have a lot more money to spend on your goods, okay, right? And so that's one thing, which is to ask the question. But also, I think you can't tax autonomy. If you reward staff with this autonomy and they value it, it's an extremely efficient way of rewarding staff for tenure of service and so on. Because it does have a material value. I mean, it's like, it's like those people who, if you, I always wanted to start a chain of private schools which were completely shit academically, but which had all the school holidays at really eccentric times of the year, so you could get cheap EasyJet flights, okay? There is a huge value if you're not condemned to do things at the same time as everybody else.
Okay, and on that, we're going to take one more question. One more question.
Anybody wants to fund that, by the way?
Live stream.
Okay.
We'll take one more from the live stream before we wrap it up. So in the US, where driving 6+ hours is not altogether uncommon, the internal locus of control for driving is generationally ingrained. So do you have any thoughts as to how to replicate some of the feelings of autonomy, privacy, and comfort in public transport? Or do we arrive at greater transit adoption through displacing those desires?
Great question.
Yeah, really, really good question. I'm reminded of some emerging research, which is starting to look a little bit more, it is very people-centric, about not just the transport choices we make because of where we live and what we need to do and all these sort of contextual things, but our personalities and our values we hold about society. And I think the question cuts right at the heart of there's the publicness in public transport and the privateness in private transport.
Yeah.
And something that some research is finding is that people are the biggest determinant of your openness to take up cycling, but also go into public transport, is that on the personality scale, openness to new experiences. So if you're already open to other new experiences, you're more likely to go into that. And that trumps value-based things about whether you're in whether you're Republican, Democrat, or whether you're how you feel about a whole number of issues about sustainability and what you think the world should look like. Simply, do you like new experiences? Are you open to being with people? Yeah, well, you're more likely to go for public transport. Now, I think quickly, that's going to be, just got to find out more about that before you can answer the question of like, could we change people's personalities? We're not there yet, but it's a really interesting point.
Extraordinary point about your point about the false dichotomy between private and public and mass and individual is that Google Maps effectively imposes on Brits American assumptions about transportation. Okay, so if where I live, okay, I say I want to travel into work, it asks me the question, basically, are you poor? Okay, you click the public transport thing and it automatically assumes I'm taking a bus to the station, okay? Because it doesn't understand, being American, that someone who owned a car might actually choose to board a train. Okay? So Google Maps, John Haidt's sister is involved in a whole campaign about this, that actually Google Maps is hugely prejudiced against public transportation. Because as soon as you say, I want to use public transportation like a train, it assumes you're getting there by bus. Anybody else notice this? It's completely crazy, okay?
It never suggests cycle to the station. I'll tell you
that. But I mean, you can drive there and park. It essentially, so you have this thing, car, it assumes you go the whole way by car. If you click the car icon, if you click the public transport icon, it assumes you don't own a car, okay? Now, I mean, that's a case which is absolutely classic in terms of, an apparently intelligent algorithm containing the prejudices of its designer. And that, when you look at that, that's, because it will never suggest drive to a station. It doesn't understand that concept, which is probably, that's, a huge chunk of British commuting and travel is exactly what you do.
Andy.
No, I think that's all the questions we have time for, unfortunately. I feel like we could listen and answer questions all night though. It's so fascinating.
Well, yeah, I agree. And believe me, I would gladly sit here all day. I could sit here all day, all night, all weekend. A lot of hours have gone into the book. I'm really pleased that it's out and it's out in the big wide world. I'm not sure what more there is to say other than I hope it's enjoyable to read. We've worked hard to synthesize a lot of research. And what doesn't come through on the pages is how much time has been spent traveling and writing on trains, in cafes, on ferries, on planes, looking out the window and seeing how people behave. And, there is behavioral science as a science. There's also behavioral science in its creative form. And I hope that comes through sort of thick and fast.
I mean, ultimately, I suppose we need to create a transport world where the sentence, because people like it, is a valid argument in justifying some form of investment. So I noticed a classic case of the sort of Gradgrindian reductionist thing, which is Victoria Station's installed quite good seating, which has little tables. Okay, I thought, well, that's a good idea. So if you've got to wait 40 minutes for a train, you can get a laptop out, you can sit there, whatever. And I went and searched the little thing to discover how they justified installing these nice tables. And the reason they justified the tables was that they found that sales of food from restaurants was increased by 16% if they're available tables, okay? Now, what we're doing is creating this world where if you've got a numerical justification, your argument is very easy to win. And if you've got an argument that involves abstract nouns, the accountants will throw you out of the room, okay? Now, this is dangerous quantification bias, really. It's absurd because it presumes that we have metrics for the things that people care about. Most of the time we don't. You know, there isn't an SI unit for regret or irritation or boredom or, you know, feeling insulted or whatever, okay? And so, I mean, quite an interesting model, by the way, is this David Rock's SCARF model, which is 5 things that humans really care about that economists don't understand, which is status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. I don't think it's a complete list, but I think it's a really good starting place, which is, look, these things have a major effect on human emotions, but we don't yet know how to quantify them. And therefore, we're designing a world as though these emotions don't exist, as though these things we care about just don't exist. And as a result, it will always be badly at odds with what people feel is naturally right. Oddly, the Victorians got it right in many ways. I mean, you know, an awful lot of the faculties of, you know, the motivation behind station design, okay, which they're cathedrals, right? They're not designed by utilitarians. And the Victorians actually got this stuff right. They felt this stuff should feel kind of amazing, you know, and you contrast St. Pancras with Euston and you kind of start to see where we went wrong.
And on that bombshell.
Yeah.